His eyes looked past people, as if the war outside hadn't broken Berlin, but his mind.
This began with a woman who kept her memories locked away for most of her life. In the spring of 1945, she was closer to Adolf Hitler than almost anyone still alive. Yet for decades, she barely spoke of it. She had seen the corridors where the war's final hours played out, heard the voices fade, felt the air grow colder as hope drained away.
Hitler is afforded wide-ranging police and political powers.
When she finally broke her silence, the truth she told was stripped of myth and ceremony. It was not a story of glory or tragedy, but of ordinary silence in the presence of extraordinary evil. The young secretary who entered the wolf's lair. In the summer of 1942, Traudl Junge was a 22-year-old woman from Munich with nimble hands on a typewriter and dreams that stretched beyond the quiet streets of her hometown. She had no strong political leanings, no clear understanding of the storm raging across Europe. What she wanted was a life that felt larger, more purposeful. When she applied for a position as a secretary in Berlin, she never imagined it would place her in the inner circle of Adolf Hitler. Her first meeting with him was almost disarming. She had expected the voice from the radio, the figure from the newsreels commanding, fiery, unapproachable. Instead, she found a man who spoke softly, avoided prolonged eye contact, and asked about her family. He seemed almost shy, courteous in a way that blurred the image she thought she knew. It was easy in those first weeks to believe she had found an important yet harmless role. The work itself was unremarkable at first. Dictation, schedules, typed speeches, letters neatly signed. She moved in the background, unnoticed except when needed, yet subtle signs began to creep in. There were meetings she was asked not to attend, papers she wasn't allowed to read, names that vanished from the daily agenda without explanation. Behind closed doors, bursts of anger shattered the calm, followed by long stretches of silence. She didn't ask why. She told herself it wasn't her business, that she was there to type, not to question. In truth, a part of her didn't want to know. Curiosity felt dangerous in a place where the air was heavy with unspoken rules. At the time, she convinced herself she was just a secretary. Later, she would realize that in such a place, no one was ever just anything. The bunker of delusion and despair. By April 1945, the world outside the Reich Chancellery was collapsing into dust. Soviet artillery pounded Berlin day and night, turning familiar streets into jagged ruins. Smoke hung over the city like a permanent cloud, carrying the bitter scent of burning stone and twisted metal. Inside the Führerbunker, life was sealed off from daylight, the air stale and damp, heavy with the knowledge that time was running out. The bunker's narrow corridors felt more like a tomb than a refuge. Fluorescent lights cast a pale, sickly glow over tired faces. Meals arrived late, cold, and sparse. Some tried to maintain routines, cleaning uniforms, shuffling papers, but these tasks no longer served any real purpose. Every person inside knew the war was lost, though no one dared speak the words aloud. Hitler had changed almost beyond recognition since Traudl Junge had first met him. His shoulders slumped forward, his steps grew uncertain, and his hands shook as he pointed to imaginary army positions on outdated maps. He spoke of divisions that no longer existed, of counterattacks that would never be launched. His eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if searching for something invisible. Eva Braun drifted through the underground rooms like a woman determined to pretend the end was not near. She wore elegant dresses, arranged flowers on tables, and laughed too loudly at small jokes. It was a performance, Traudl thought, and a fragile one at that, the kind that could shatter with the wrong word. As the days passed, the atmosphere thickened with a strange mix of denial and resignation. Outside, the city was dying in fire. Inside, its leaders were shrinking into shadows of themselves, clinging to rituals that no longer mattered. The bunker was not a command center anymore. It was a waiting room for history's final verdict, and every soul inside knew their turn was coming.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
The final orders and the death nobody saw. On the night of April 29, 1945, Traudl Junge was called into one of the bunker's smaller, dimly lit rooms. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken knowledge. Hitler sat at the table, pale and shrunken, dictating the words that would become his final will and political testament. Traudl placed her fingers on the typewriter keys and began to work. The sentences were sharp, bitter, and stripped of any remorse. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments of the devastation beyond the bunker walls. Instead, the text seethed with accusations, naming traitors, condemning allies who had abandoned him, and reaffirming the ideology that had driven the Reich into ruin.
Hitler got crazy.
It was as if he believed that even in defeat, he could still shape the story history would tell. When the document was complete, Hitler signed it with a trembling hand. Soon after, Eva Braun began quietly moving through the rooms, giving away personal items, a brooch to one person, a scarf to another. She didn't speak of what was coming, but her actions carried the weight of farewell. Her smile was soft but distant, as though she were already halfway gone. The next afternoon, the door to Hitler's private quarters closed for the last time. Outside in the corridor, the atmosphere tightened. A muffled gunshot cracked through the silence. No one rushed to confirm what they already knew. Within minutes, aides carried out the bodies, wrapped them hastily, and doused them with petrol in the garden above. Traudl didn't watch the flames, but the smell of gasoline and gunpowder drifted back down into the bunker, mingling with the damp air. There was no ceremony, no spoken mourning, only the mechanical completion of an order. It struck her then, in a way it never had before. She had been working for a man already dead in spirit long before that bullet was fired. The end was not sudden. It had been unfolding quietly for weeks. After the silence, a life in the shadows. When Soviet forces finally closed in, the bunker's occupants scattered like ghosts into a city that no longer resembled Berlin. Traudl Junge slipped out among them, moving through streets where buildings leaned like broken teeth, the air thick with ash and the echo of distant gunfire. She was captured not far from the city, questioned, and held for a short period. To her interrogators, she was a secretary, young, peripheral, hardly worth prosecuting. Eventually, they let her go. Freedom did not feel like release. She carried with her the weight of what she had seen, and perhaps more painfully, what she had chosen not to see. Every sound, every face from those final days lingered in her mind. The muttered orders, the hollow laughter, the smell of gasoline seeping through concrete. She tried to fold herself back into ordinary life. There were jobs in publishing houses, brief stays in different cities, and long stretches where she spoke to no one about her past. To neighbors, she was polite but reserved. To colleagues, efficient but distant. Her connection to Hitler was a fact she kept locked away, as if silence could erase it. But silence has its sharp edges. It doesn't dull guilt, it preserves it. With every passing year, the truth became harder to ignore. She had not been forced into loyalty at gunpoint. She had not been threatened into complicity. She had simply gone along, too curious about the proximity to power, too unwilling to risk the discomfort of knowing more. By the time decades had passed, her understanding of those choices had grown painfully clear. She was not innocent. She was not a victim. She had been part of something monstrous, not by design but by submission. And in her mind, that was its kind of crime. The truth she carried to her grave. It wasn't until the early 2000s that Traudl Junge allowed the dam of silence to break. By then, she was in her 80s, her hair silver, her voice steady but softened by time. She agreed to appear in Blind Spot, a documentary that would become her final testimony. She spoke without drama, without the flourish of someone seeking attention. Her words were deliberate, as if each had been weighed for years before being spoken aloud. She dismantled the images people had of Hitler's last days. There was no tragic grandeur, no final act of noble defiance. What she remembered was a man diminished, pacing narrow corridors, mumbling orders to armies that no longer existed. She spoke of Eva Braun's quiet resignation, her laughter sounding more like an echo than joy. The bunker, she said, felt less like a command post and more like a place where people waited for the inevitable. What struck listeners most was not what Traudl saw, but what she admitted she had refused to see. She confessed that she had been fascinated by Hitler's charm when she first met him, and that she had never asked about the world outside her typewriter. The crimes were there, but she had turned away from them. Her warning was simple and piercing. Evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. It hides in routines, in polite requests, in the ease of telling yourself your role is too small to matter. You don't need to act violently to be complicit. Sometimes all it takes is doing your job without asking where the orders lead. Traudl Junge never called herself innocent. She died in 2002, just hours after the premiere of Blind Spot, leaving her final testimony fresh in the world's mind. She spoke not to clear her name, but to warn how easily people drift into complicity. She wanted others to see that great crimes are often built from small silences. Her story was not about a dictator's last days, but about the quiet choices that let him endure. The war ended decades before she spoke, yet in breaking her silence, she left behind something lasting, a reminder to question, even when it's dangerous.